Hello friends, how are you doing today? I am Dr. Ankit Shrivastava, Assistant Professor of Law at RGNUL Punjab. Before introducing you to today's topic of discussion, let me pose a situation before you. Let's suppose you live on the 5th floor of a building. On a Sunday morning, you are watering the plants on your balcony. The plants are in pots and the pots are kept on the railing of the balcony. While watering, some water spilled on the ground. Before you could wipe it, your brother came running towards you, and because of the spilled water on the ground, he slipped and lost his balance. Now, while trying to regain his balance, he tries to hold on to the railing, but mistakenly pushes one of the pots down. Mr. Jethalal was coming back home happily after buying Sunday morning snacks to enjoy the same while watching some movies on Netflix. But contrary to his plans, the pot fell on his head and he got severely injured. Whether you will be liable under tort law in this situation? In the context of the above example, let me introduce you to the topic. The topic of our discussion today is relevance, intent, knowledge, malice, good faith, and motive in torts. Before we talk about the relevance of all these terms, it is important for us to define these words. Let's see them one by one and understand the meaning of these terms. The first term that we'll discuss today is intent. So the term intention refers to a mental state of purpose or design to achieve a particular goal or outcome. It entails the deliberate and conscious decision to execute an act or behave in a particular way with a specific objective in mind. The next term is knowledge. A consciousness or understanding of a specific fact or piece of information is referred to as knowledge. It is a condition of being aware of something, and it can be obtained through a variety of channels including communication, education, observation, and personal experience. The next term is malice. A state of mind characterized by ill will, animosity, or a desire to harm others without cause or justification is referred to as malice. It entails intentional behavior with the purpose of hurting, injuring, or damaging another person or their property. The next term that we'll be discussing is good faith. An honest and sincere intention to act in a just, rational, and moral way is referred to as having good faith. It calls for a mindset that is characterized by honesty, trust, and a sincere desire to carry out the proper action. The next term is motive. The term motive refers to the underlying reason or goal that underlies a person's activity or behave and include the subjective elements that affect a person's choice to act in a certain way, such as personal beliefs, goals, or interests. Let me just tell you in short that what is the difference between motive and intent. Now, just giving you an example, motive is something which you think of doing, and intent is that path that you take to achieve that thing. For example, that you want to pass the exam, but you want to, and that is a motive that you want to pass the exam. But cheating in the exam is your intent to pass that exam. So this is the difference between motive and intent. Now let's go on to the relevance of these terms in the law of tort. The first one is intention. Someone may be held liable in a tort if they cause harm to the victim's reputation, property, or other aspects of their life. Tort law permits the possibility of liability regardless of whether the harm was inflicted with intent or accidentally. A tort can be split into two major based on the intention, namely intentional tort or the unintentional tort. The first one is intentional tort. The specific conduct must be carried out with the aim of doing so in order to be considered an intentional tort, meaning that there must be an intention to perform the act. It is essential that there be a mental component. In the case of Gerhardt versus Daly, in 1955, a small kid named Brian knocked a chair out from under Ruth Gerhardt as she tries to sit down. Ruth tripped and broke her hip as a result of Brian's pulling on the chair. Ruth claimed in her complaint that because Brian's family had misbehaved, they were to blame for her physical injuries. Ruth got $11,000 in damages even though Brian didn't intend to hurt her. Children under the age of 5 cannot be held accountable for an intentional tort, according to Brian's family's appeal. The court found that the intent factor is present and that juveniles can be held accountable if they knew beyond a reasonable doubt that their action could cause injury. Now, there are certain aspects in intentional tort that it incorporates. Like there are different types of intentional torts, we can say. The first one being assault and battery. So, assault is when one person acts in a way that another person perceives as either intended to inflict such harm or likely to do so. A battery differs from an assault since it involves physical contact, whereas an assault does not, because the goal is to intimidate rather than inflict harm. And when someone uses physical force against another person with the aim of hurting them, then it is called battery. The next type of intentional tort is false imprisonment. It is the subject's unlawful and against his will detention. False imprisonment is forbidden even if a person is unable to leave a place against their will because it is not necessary to put the person in jail. A physical barrier like a locked room, the use of physical force, though the actual use of force is not always required, and the wrongful use of legal authority are all examples of this. Fraudulent imprisonment includes fraudulent arrests as well as police custody of a person without a warrant. Malicious prosecution is a subset of false imprisonment. The next type is trespass. It is trespassing on someone else's property, possession, or other items with intent and unreasonableness. No matter how insignificant, the unwarranted intervention may annoy or harm the other person. An owner's legal right is violated when it is abused or exploited in a way that prevents the owner from reaping the benefits of the asset. The next type of tort is an unintentional tort. An unanticipated tort occurs when the defendant injures the plaintiff without meaning to. It could count as an unexpected accident. The individual who hurt you did this accidentally because they weren't being careful. Such a person may be deemed careless or negligent. It's critical to recognize that when there is an unintentional tort, the harm came about as a result of a failure to uphold the duty of care that a prudent and reasonable person would have upheld. In the case of Wilkinson versus Downtown, the defendant made fun of the fact that her husband was hurt in an accident and taken to the hospital. She was frightened to learn this knowledge and immediately became ill. She then filed a tort claim for damages against the defendant. The accused claimed that he never had planned to do anything evil and had only ever sought to make jokes. The judge rejected his defense and found him guilty. In this decision, the court acknowledged that a simple purpose was not necessary for a tort to exist. The defendant's acts caused harm to plaintiff even though they were aware of their obvious and predictable effects. He was accountable as a result, whether or not it was his purpose. Moving on to the next topic, that is knowledge as a relevance in the tort law. In tort law, knowledge is an essential component, especially in cases of negligence. When someone fails to use reasonable care and injures or harms another person as a result, that is considered to be negligence, which is a sort of a tort. The plaintiff must demonstrate 4 elements, that is, duty of care, violation of that duty, causation, and the damages, in order to establish negligent liability. Knowledge is relevant in the second and third elements. As discussed below, the first is breach of duty. Now, a person has a responsibility to treat other person with care to prevent harm. The court will take into account what a prudent person in the same circumstance would have done when deciding whether a person has violated this duty of care. A person may be found to have violated their duty of care by failing to take the necessary precautions to prevent injury if they knew or should have known that there was a specific risk or danger linked to their action or omissions. And the second is causation. The plaintiff must prove underlying connection between the defendant's breach of duty and the plaintiff's suffering or injury, in addition to proving the defendant's duty was broken. It may be easier to prove causation if the defendant knew or should have known that their actions or inactions caused a specific risk or hazard that led to the plaintiff's harm or injury. Knowledge is also relevant in proving liability for intentional tort. For instance, if the defendant willfully or without cause injures the plaintiff will need to demonstrate that the defendant intended to do so. In certain situations, the plaintiff might have to provide proof that the defendant was aware of the risk or hazard involved in their activities in order to prove their intent. The next term we'll discuss is malice. In its common meaning, malice is a synonym for spite or ill will. When anything is done maliciously, it is referred to as malice. When used for purposes that are not authorized by the appropriate legal authorities, an act or statement is considered malevolent. Malice can be discussed in both legal and common sense contexts. It is referred to as malice in law in the legal sense and denotes intentional wrongdoing without a just cause or excuse or a lack of reasonable or probable cause. In the popular sense, it is known as malice in fact and denotes an improper or evil motive. Here, it emphasizes that just because something is done with good intention doesn't make it legal. The court stated that mere malice cannot disentitle a person from taking recourse to law for getting the wrong undone. In the case of Town Area Committee versus Prabhu Dayal. Therefore, it is not required to look into whether the activity is being done out of malice or not. Now, there are certain exceptions to this rule of malice. Malice becomes important in determining tort liability in the following situations. First one, when the act is otherwise unlawful and it is obvious from the circumstances that it was performed with malice. In the case of Balak Glass Emporium versus United India Insurance Company Limited, water from an upper story of a multi-story structure under the defendant's control flowed onto the lower floor that the plaintiff was occupying. There was proof that the plaintiff and defendant were hostile towards one another. The tank's outflow was closed and the tap on the upper floor was completely open. It was determined that the plaintiff was entitled to damages for the above mentioned act, since there was only one reasonable presumption that the defendant meant to give rise to a claim for damages. The second exception is in deceit and malicious prosecution torts, malice with regards to the litigant must be proven. The third is the appearance of malice in defamation proceedings negates good faith, and the defendant cannot escape culpability in such a situation by raising the defense of qualified privilege. Next, a legitimate act that is otherwise lawful may become a nuisance if it causes someone else pain for illegal reasons. Malice, which results in aggravation of damages, is the last exception of malice as a theory in tort. The next is good faith. Now, good faith is a term used in tort law to describe an honest and sincere desire to treat people fairly and rationally. Many legal interactions, such as those resulting from contracts, business dealings, and other dealings, often imply the concept of good faith. When establishing whether a defendant has breached their duty of care towards the plaintiff, the idea of good faith is frequently significant. In case of medical malpractice, for instance, a doctor who commits a mistake in good faith may not be held accountable for malpractice if their acts were in accordance with standard medical procedures. Similarly, if a defendant can demonstrate that their acts were reasonable and commensurate with the standard of care expected of them, they may be able to refute an allegation of carelessness in cause of negligence. In business dealings between parties, the concept of good faith is typically taken for granted. For instance, if a salesperson knowingly offers a customer a product with a flaw without disclosing it, it may be liable for the tort of false misrepresentation. Similar to this, if a party willfully and intentionally breaches their contractual obligations, they may be held liable for breach of contract. A defendant in a defamation case may be able to escape responsibility if they can demonstrate that their statement was made in good faith. For instance, if a journalist can demonstrate that they made a defamatory statement in good faith and with a reasonable conviction that it was true, they may be exempted from punishment for doing so. Overall, the concept of good faith is significant in tort law because it encourages parties to engage with others in a fair and reasonable manner. In circumstances involving contractual or business duties, a violation of the principle of good faith may give rise to a cause of action for tortious liability. The idea of good faith is frequently essential in deciding whether a defendant has breached their duty of care or acted carelessly. The next topic that we'll be discussing is about motive as a relevance in the tort law. A motive is the mental condition that drives a person to perform an action. It usually refers to the reason why the act was committed. Similar to purpose, motive is often unimportant in tort law. Motive, which leads to the creation of an intention, is the root cause. The immediate goal is regarded as the intention, but the driving force behind the activity is referred to as the motive. I hope you remember my example from the earlier part of this lecture regarding your passing of exam and you cheating in the exam for doing so. The rationale behind a person's decision to take a particular action is referred to as motivation in law, particularly criminal law. The legal system often permits motives to be demonstrated in order to give the accused credible explanations for committing a crime. However, a tort lawsuit does not need to be motivated in order to succeed. Legal wrongdoing is not necessarily the result of justification. A legal action cannot be made unlawful due to inappropriate motivation, evil motivation, or malicious intent. One of the first cases to establish that motive is irrelevant in tort law was Bradford Corporation versus Pickles and Allen versus Flood, decided by the Lord Halsbury and Lord Watson. Now let's see the first case, that is the Bradford Corporation versus Pickles. Let's see the facts of this case. The plaintiff's land was underlain by the water springs that were used to supply Bradford town with water for more than 40 years. The defendant held more land than the plaintiff on a higher level. Water trickled down to the plaintiff's springs from a natural reservoir that existed beneath the defendant's property. but the defendant changed the water flow on his property by digging a shaft through it. The plaintiff's spring's water flow was considerably curtailed as a result. There was enough evidence to support the idea that the defendant used this course of action slowly to deny the plaintiff's access to water and not to benefit himself immediately. The plaintiffs maintained that the defendant's action were malicious and that they were entitled to an injunction to prevent them. Now, the court held that the ability to do the act cannot be affected by the mental condition of the person performing it. Regardless of his motivation, if it was legal, he was within his rights to carry it out. The judge also said that he finds motives and intentions to be utterly meaningless in a question like the one that is currently before this court. No use of property that would be lawful if motivated by a legitimate reason cannot turn unlawful because it is driven by an improper or even wicked reason. The second case that we'll be discussing is Allen versus Flood. The facts were that shipwright Flood and Walter were employed on a ship but were subject to termination at any time. Co-workers resisted their hiring because they had previously worked for a competitor employer. Allen, a trade union leader for the other personnel aboard the ship, went to the bosses and threatened them with a walkout if they would not release Flood and Walter. As a result, the employers fired Flood and Walter and declined to rehire them in any other capacity. Flood and Walter filed the lawsuit with the intent to maliciously create a contract breach. It was held that Allen was found not to have infringed any of Flood and Walter's legal rights, and the decision was reversed. Allen did not engage in any illegal behavior or act to terminate the employees because they lacked the legal right to work for the company. The jury found that Allen warned the employers about the repercussions of keeping Flood and Walter on the payroll. He relied on his forecasts of what would happen and trusted his superiors. No rights were considered to have been violated, blocked, or otherwise disturbed by this. Even if it appeared likely that Allen was acting deliberately, his actions were not illegal. Indian courts have discussed malice in tort cases as well as irrelevant motives. The courts ruled in Vishnu Vasudev versus THS Pierce and Town Area Committee versus Prabhu Dayal that it is important to determine if the act was legal before considering its motivation. As a conclusion, we could state that a good purpose shouldn't be used to excuse otherwise illegal behavior, and a poor motive shouldn't turn an otherwise lawful action into a wrong one. Now, there are certain exceptions to this rule. There are some types of torts where the motive might be a crucial component and hence important when determining responsibility. When the defense of fair comment or privilege is possible, such as in situations involving dishonesty, malicious prosecution, harmful lies, and defamation. Only if it is published in good faith with the defense of qualified privilege be available. In the event of a conspiracy, commercial interference, or contractual obligation. According to Palmer versus Lauder case, creating personal distress for illegal purposes can turn an otherwise legitimate act into a nuisance in nuisance cases. So now, focus on the situation I described in the beginning and answer to yourself whether you will be liable or not in the case or in the situation that I told you in the beginning of the lecture. So with this, we come to the end of today's lecture. I hope you understood it well. Thank you for your patience.